Welcome to the Rex Andrews Show. Wow, glad to have you here today. If you're a first-time listener, we're glad you found us. And if you're a returning listener, I want to say something to you today. Thank you, because we recently found out that the show is in the top 10% fastest growing podcasts out there. So that's pretty exciting when you consider there's over 1 million podcasters out there today. All right, a little bit of house cleaning. Don't forget to subscribe wherever you're listening. We're on over 23 different podcast distribution systems out there. So just subscribe. And then always on social media, just about everyone out there and even some of the new ones. So please subscribe, follow us, and join in on the conversation. Love to get your comments, your feedback, and we love to have you come along for the conversation. Well, today I've got a fantastic guest, and I am really excited this because I'm a geek. Okay, so I've spent 35 plus years in technology, and I work every day on my other stuff of helping people drive internet traffic. And so our guest today is fascinating because I know a lot of people need to learn more about this subject. And I'm going to welcome on one of the top experts in Bitcoin. Welcome, Jimmy Song. Jimmy, how are you today?
I am doing fantastic. Glad to be on your show. Obviously, getting a chance to talk to your audience is a privilege. So thank you.
Great to have you. Now, we always, I always tell people this. I know my return listeners get tired of my colloquialism on this, but I believe that life is a series of stones that we step on as we're crossing a stream. Now, we hope we don't fall off, but what we do is we hop from one to the other, right? And, the journey ends at some point in time, but we're getting across this stream. And sometimes we do a lot of pivoting, and sometimes we have to take a step back and go forward. So let's go back and let's tell the Jimmy Song story. So let's help our audience understand how you got to be who you are today. So I understand before we were going live here today that you were actually from South Korea. So can you help us start on those first steps?
Yeah, I was born in South Korea. My parents decided to immigrate to the United States because my dad had an opportunity with his company to be sort of the guy that was posted in New York. At the time, he was working at a textile manufacturer. And of course, a lot of clothing was made in Korea back in the 80s. So he took our family and we lived in New Jersey while he worked in the Empire State Building in New York. And it was like right next to the Diamond Exchange on the 66th floor. For anyone that is familiar with New York and the Empire State Building, I still remember like going there as a kid. I was like, wow, this building's really, really big. But that's how I came to America. Like I think 5 years later, he was recalled back to Korea, and he told them no. we're going to stay here because there's better opportunities for my kids. Still very grateful to my dad that we did that, and I've been in the U.S. ever since. And basically went to college at Michigan, did a bunch of startups, and in Boston, I moved here to Austin about 9 years ago, and pretty much the entire time since I've been in America, I've been addicted to computers and programming and all things like that. So it's part of my makeup at this point.
Okay. So help me understand your family makeup. Did you have some siblings then?
I have one sister. She's out in California right now. And my parents now live in LA. But yeah, we're close-knit family, like many immigrant families are, and it's been an interesting experience. I actually just watched the movie Minari. I don't know if you've heard of it.
Yes, I have.
But but like just watching it was like, wow, I can't believe there's actually a movie about like very similar to my experience with the grandma and all these like little Korean things. But yeah, it was very impactful for me having watched it.
Okay, so knowing that you're in Austin and your parents are in California, have you not been able to convince them to do the California exodus to Texas?
Well, they exited from New Jersey a few years ago. And they're like a really nice retirement community and everything. So they enjoy it. It's just the current sort of lockdown kind of stinks, but what can you really do?
Yeah, it's a goofy world. Now, I understand you're a family man and you have a few kids. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, we have 6 kids. They range from 4 to 14. My wife and I wanted a big family. I've always been sort of an extrovert, if you can't tell, and I always wanted like a big family, right? Like just so I'm always around a lot of people, and yeah, that's what we have right now. I'm really enjoying it. And the job that I have now, more or less like doing all things Bitcoin, affords me the opportunity to stay at home and hang out with my kids. And, I'm going to drive one of my kids to gymnastics later today and things like that. Like just it's a lot better for me being able to, spend more time with them and hang out with them while they're growing up. As I know you have like 5 kids,
Yes.
and, every older person that I've talked to says, enjoy this time because you're going to miss it like crazy.
Oh yeah, I was telling you before we got on the air. My daughter. I have 3 daughters and 2 sons, and I miss, believe it or not, as a man, I miss dance recitals. That's wacky. And then my boys both had stellar football careers, and so I was like a football addict. There were weeks I would go to 3 live games, depending on what the levels my boys were playing. So that's awesome.
Mm,
Now, Austin's, and I've spent quite a bit of time down in Austin. I used to do a lot of
mm,
work with Dell Computer back in the day, and Austin is an awesome town. I mean, it's grown a ton, but
mm,
man, some of the best barbecue and times, and going out to Elgin, going out to the meat market in Elgin, and
mm,
then out to
mm,
the Salt Lick there, southwest of
mhm.
Austin. I mean, gosh, I could talk for hours on that, but that's not what we're here to talk about. All right. So help me out. We got to start. I think a lot of people have obviously heard of Bitcoin, okay,
Mm,
but they probably really don't know what that means. Okay, what is
mm.
it? Okay, and so let's start in sort of the beginning. What is Bitcoin?
Yeah, Bitcoin has been called a lot of things, right? Geek
Right.
money, internet money, some sort of digital form of money, and all of those things have some truth to them. But the way I like to describe Bitcoin is digital, decentralized, and scarce money. Okay.
Okay.
Digital, decentralized, and scarce money. And all of those things mean something specific. So let's start with centralized versus decentralized. So there's something like decentralized money, and that would be an example of that would be gold. You don't need anyone's permission to try to dig for gold. I
Right.
could go in my backyard right now with a shovel and try to search for gold. Probably not going to be successful because gold's
No.
hard to find,
Right.
but anyone can go and do it. There's you don't need some governing authority to give you permission or whatever. You just go in and dig for it, and that's it. That's what we call decentralized. You don't need any permission from anybody, and there's no central authority. Centralized things are, where you have an authority. So, for example, the U.S. dollar is created by the Federal Reserve. This is the central bank of the United States, and there are central banks in other countries as well. The Bank of Japan, the Bank of Europe, Bank of China, many others. But they have a central bank that issues them. And of course, the Treasury prints the actual bills. And if you create your own bills, you're going to get arrested by the Secret Service because only the people that are allowed can print more of that money. And so
Right.
that centralized money versus decentralized money. Now, a large reason why we have centralized money is because you can also you can digitize centralized money. So, for example, most US dollars, of all the US dollars in existence, only about 5 or 6% is actually in bills, notes, and coins. Vast majority of it is just on some bank ledger somewhere. So
Right.
something like 94%. So that's where most of the dollars exist, and it's digital, and it's digital because it's very convenient, right? Like you don't
Right.
have to transport it anywhere. And most of our transactions, unless you're using cash, which is becoming less and less frequent these days, it's done digitally. If you swipe a credit card, it calls to Visa, MasterCard, or American Express or whatever, and then they convey back, okay, well, we're debiting from your account and crediting the merchant's account and so on. So that's how digital systems work. Now, until 2009, there was nothing that was both decentralized and digital. And that's what Bitcoin is. It's both decentralized, as in there's no central authority that lets you do whatever, um, and it's digital. It's decentralized and digital. And if it sounds almost like impossible, that's what we actually thought before 2009. Was no one actually thought it was possible until this computer science breakthrough came through in the form of Bitcoin.
Yep.
And that's the actual thing about it. And the third thing is that it's also scarce, which is kind of crazy because nothing is like perfectly scarce like Bitcoin is. There will only ever be 21 million Bitcoins. Now, don't get nervous. There's one Bitcoin is divisible down to 8 decimal places, or 100 million Satoshi. Satoshi is sort of like the base unit. So there's 2.1 quadrillion Satoshi in the Bitcoin system. But that's another very important property. So how do we get decentralized, digitally scarce money? Well, I can describe the mechanism to you, but basically, your mental model of digital things is generally something like either like an MP3 file or something like that, which you copy. And PDF you can infinitely copy it, right? Yeah. Anything, like you can just copy it, and you get like, how can you have money that's like that? Well, there's a way to do it with essentially a ledger, and that's how it works. Is that it's like your bank. When you deposit $500 to your bank, they don't put the $500 into a drawer that's labeled with your name. They just put it into the vault and credit your account $500. And when you pay with a check, they debit from your account and credit somebody else's account. That's how it works. That's what a ledger is. Essentially, Bitcoin has this giant ledger. It's called the blockchain, and it contains every single transaction that's ever been done in Bitcoin. Now, that's not a small file. That's
it's huge.
100 gigabytes of data, because we have 12 years of history now. But that's what that file contains, or like many files actually on this. But who cares, right? Like it's just a large ledger, and everybody that is running what's called a Bitcoin node, it's software, has that entire ledger and can check and verify that all of those are legit. So your bank, if you overdraw on your account, will like either not let it go through or charge you all sorts of fees. Bitcoin makes it so that your software makes sure no one is overdrawing their account, and no one is creating more Bitcoin or doing something weird or nefarious, which is very common in the financial system today. So essentially, that's what Bitcoin is. It's decentralized, digital, scarce money, and it is and the rules are enforced by software that each person can run and can verify on their own.
Wow. So, the scarce part was something I didn't understand. Okay. And even though I'm a technologist, again, I've never really delved into this and stuff. So the software that controls that, is there an entity or an organization that's creating the software for Bitcoin?
Yeah. So there's so Satoshi Nakamoto created the first software, and this was called Bitcoin Core software. That software continues today, but there's alternate software as well. So there's something called BTCD. There's B Core and or Bitcoin and LibBitcoin and several others. I can't remember all of them, but they all essentially do the same thing, which is check the software. Now, Bitcoin Core is the most popular one, mostly because it was based on the original client software that Satoshi Nakamoto wrote. But that software is continuously developed. But here's the guarantee about the software that's very important: it's always backwards compatible. So you can run the very first version of Bitcoin, and it'll still sort of validate the entire ledger, and it'll conclude that like these are legitimate coins and so on. A lot of other sort of copycats to Bitcoin, what we call altcoins. You might have heard of some of them, Ethereum, Litecoin, or whatever. They're not backwards compatible. In fact, they change their software like every 6 months or so. So there is sort of like that, what we would call centralized, because there's a single point at which, they can change the rules or do different things, and they have.
Yeah. Well, we've seen that in other technologies that people are used to. When you look at like iPhones,
Mm,
there's planned obsolescence with iPhones
mm,
and stuff. And so, remember, I think it was about a year back or so, Apple got sued because they were obsolescing. Like I think it was the versions 4 and 5 iPhones, because they basically wrote new features into the iOS that
mm,
basically made those devices basically obsolete, so people had to upgrade. So that's a debate. But backwards compatibility in technology is huge, and the
mm,
average layman doesn't understand that, because when you make an investment into any type of technology, and then and if you don't keep up, which is so easy to do,
mm,
then you've got yourself painted into a corner. I mean,
mhm.
that's not a good thing. So, well, that's pretty smart the way they did that for backwards compatibility.
Well, it's an important part of our sovereignty too, right?
Yeah, right,
Because if you're forced to upgrade, then there is a central party that gets to control the network. And
right,
by making it so that it's always backwards compatible, it makes it so that no one is in control of the entire network by forcing an upgrade. This
right,
is not the case for a lot of these altcoins or copycats of Bitcoin or whatever. Is that they force upgrades on everybody? At which point, which means that if you can force the upgrade, you can change the rules. You can say, oh, instead of 21 million, it's going to be 27 million now, or something
right.
like that, which would, destroy the integrity of the system. And that's a very key part of what makes Bitcoin Bitcoin.
Okay. So I understand that you've got into this at a very deep level. Did
Mm.
you start out programming, or, help us understand your journey a little bit in Bitcoin? We've got a ton more questions, but I mean, where did you get started in Bitcoin?
Yeah, I got started in Bitcoin in 2011. I've been a programmer all of my career, right? I started with computers like at 9 years old, and on like a Commodore 16 and stuff like that. I don't know if you remember that
Oh,
particular.
yeah.
Yeah. But my dad kept seeing that I love computers, so he got me like a better and better one as I grew older, and I've been programming all my life,
I mean,
and so,
I have to stop you there, because I know you know
Mhm,
this. Can
mhm.
you imagine when we got our first floppy disks and you thought no one could ever fill one of those?
I, I
Remember?
still remember in the classroom we had like the cassette tapes. Do you remember
Oh,
those?
yeah.
It
Well,
was like a pet computer or something.
I'm almost a generation older than you, I'm guessing, and
Uh-huh.
I can remember my first projects were the punch cards, the old IBM
Oh
punch
wow,
cards. And
yeah, that's definitely a
you
generational
want to know a
entity.
terrible story? When I was in college, I had this project that I had these punch cards, and I had them in this tray, and I walked out of the university labs, and I was going down the stairs, and I happened to see this gorgeous young lady walking by, and I was staring at her, and I missed a step. Boom, I fell, and my punch cards went
Oh
into the
no,
wind.
and you need them in order
Oh,
too,
yeah,
right? Like
right.
because
It's not just having them in the box. It's having them in the box in order. So that was crazy. But anyway, I digress. Let's go back. So you started. Now you were a programmer. So how did you? Let's see that step into that.
Yeah, so I started doing startups right out of college, and I worked as a programmer for something like 13 years before I saw this story. And the story I saw was on a website called Slashdot, which is sort of like a news site for web geeks, for
Yep.
tech geeks or whatever.
Yep.
And it was a story that I usually know something about every story, right? Because I was used to seeing all the articles, oh, here's another Linux distro, here's a patent troll that's doing something nefarious, here's you know a new Mac or something like that. Those are the types of stories. And then I saw one story that said Bitcoin reaches dollar parity, and I was like, what is Bitcoin and what does it mean to reach parity? I couldn't really even parse the sentence. So
Right.
clicked into it, and I started reading about it, and boom, it just like hit me like a ton of bricks, right? Like it was such a revelation, just like reading about it. And I've been primed a little bit from 2008 with the great financial crisis and everything.
Sure.
I've been more or less traumatized and like
Right.
looked into sort of the economic aspect. So when I read that it had a 21 million limit, that was immediately when I began to think, oh crap, if this becomes at all popular, I better be one of the first people to get in on this
Right.
thing
Right.
instead of one of the last people. And this is, I think, like a natural human instinct to want something that's scarce. And I
Sure.
understood that even if it was digital, that there could be some scarcity. Now, I didn't know all the details back then, but I had a vague idea.
Sure.
And that was enough for me to like start looking into how to buy it. And back then, it was really difficult. There was a site called Mt. Gox in Japan, and that was mainly where most people traded. And in order to get money to Mt. Gox, what you had to do was use this dollar gateway called Dwala, and you had to link your bank account to Dwala, and that took like 5 days. And then after you had the account on Dwala, then you can link to Mt. Gox, your Mt. Gox account. That took like another week or two.
Right.
And then at that point, you can transfer money to Mt. Gox, and then you can buy Bitcoin. So one of the biggest regrets of my life was not buying when I first heard about it, when Bitcoin was $1,
Yeah.
because it was so annoying to get money to Mt. Gox. So
So,
that's what kind of got me started,
okay.
was reading that story.
You know, I understand blockchain, but a lot
Mm,
of people don't. And
mm,
for many people, it's such a paradigm shift from
mm,
even for people who are immersed in the tech industry. Did
mm.
you have a hard time getting your head around blockchain?
I mean, that didn't really become a thing until like 2013, 2014. And by then I was like fully coding in it.
Okay.
Like even the word blockchain wasn't like that prominent early on. I think Satoshi called it like a time chain or something like that.
Right.
It was a very different thing. And it really wasn't until 2014 that like the word blockchain became sort of like almost a corporate buzzword.
Right.
Like every company was like, hey, we got a blockchain project. We don't like this Bitcoin, but we like the technology behind it, right?
Right.
And I've written a lot of articles sort of debunking that like whole concept that it's blockchain that's important and not Bitcoin and all that stuff. But sort of wrapping my head around the tech did take some time, and
Yeah.
especially when I got started on some of those open source projects in 2013. I like when I was so I got started on the open source project. Like there was a Reddit subreddit called Jobs for Bitcoin back in 2013.
Okay.
And I went on there, was looking at various jobs, and one guy had posted, "Hey, Python programmers wanted for this project, and I'll pay you in Bitcoin." I was like, "All right, done. I'm a Python programmer. I can do this."
Sure.
And he so I contacted him back. Turned out that this guy was out of the Ukraine. He was working on this thing called color coins on top of Bitcoin. The details of that aren't particularly important, but he was in the Ukraine and he was looking for programs. So I'll do it. And he gave me some work, and he's like, "Yeah, try to do this, and see, bring it back, and I'll pay you, based on your hourly rate." So I was like, "All right." So I programmed it, sent it back pretty quickly, like a few hours, and he was like, "Great, here's some more work, and here's some more work, here's some more work." I got paid in Bitcoin from a guy in the Ukraine, for an open source project in 2013, right? Like it just
Oh my
like absolutely
goodness.
mind blowing. And I'm
Right.
getting paid like on a weekly basis. I also have a 40-hour a week job. I have like a bunch of kids, and I'm doing all of this at the same time. And at that point, I was like working like 80 hours a week because I had 40 hours at my normal job. And I was like doing 40 hours on this because Bitcoin was going up at that point, right? Like he hired me right at the bull run of 2013, right around October. So
Right.
every week I was like, I need to get more work in so I could get paid, right? Like, and it was like, and like to this day, that's probably one of the best like per hour rates that I've ever earned, because like he paid me in Bitcoin. And
Wow.
I wasn't charging all that much, but in Bitcoin terms, it was a lot. And right now, one Bitcoin is like $53,000. So that
Right.
was actually a decent amount. So that was part of my journey of learning. And what I found as a programmer was that there weren't that many resources. to sort of like learn a lot of that stuff. You have to understand it was fairly early. And like, the way Bitcoin works with blocks and transactions and all that, it took a while for me to sort of like wrap my head around, although I had plenty of motivation because I was getting paid in Bitcoin. So that in itself was wonderful.
Yeah. So I'm going to help our users who aren't quite the geeks that we are. And of course, geek is an affectionate term. But Python is a programming language. And so if people don't know what Python is, and then real quick, if you could just drop a very short blockchain, just something very short on blockchain.
Yeah, so blockchain is sort of like a subset of a database. A database is, just where you put your data so that it's quickly accessible and sort of things like that. The blockchain is basically Bitcoin's ledger, and it has all of the transaction information that you've ever done, that Bitcoin has ever done. So among other things, it's more or less easily auditable. You can make sure that no one is spending more than they're supposed to, like is creating extra Bitcoin or anything like that. And there's a bunch of other rules around that particular database. But essentially what Bitcoin is a giant ledger, which is in this case, the blockchain. That's what we call the blockchain, and it's literally a chain of blocks, by the way, which you can sort of think of as pages in the ledger. So each new page has to be consistent with the rest of the other pages, and so on. And that's more or less how I would describe it. As it's a subset of a database. It's a form of a database. It's just got transaction data in it.
So even taking the geekdom a little less specific for most people, we've had databases that migrated from flat file systems to relational databases, and then you migrate up to the Bitcoin. And the biggest thing for a layman to understand is, even in the largest relational databases, you had limitations to the number of tables in a database. And so blockchain helped break through those barriers. And again, that's another whole conversation. But anyway, I always try to bring it back to think about, what if I'm a soccer mom listening to this today and I don't really understand that stuff? So anyway, basically, this is a great new technology. All right. So you got in and started programming. How many years were you in doing programming?
So I started programming Bitcoin stuff in 2013. I'd been programming all my life before then. So it was something that I was pretty used to. And I got hired by a company called Monetas, which was out of Switzerland. And that was my first sort of real Bitcoin job, other than the open source stuff that I was getting paid for. And then I got hired by Armory, which is a wallet software company. And this was one of the early Bitcoin wallets where you can sort of store your Bitcoin. Then after that, I worked at a company called Paxos, which had an exchange by the name of Itbit. They're still operating today. They're out of New York. And after that, I had done some. At Monetas and at Paxos, I had taught a bunch of the developers what Bitcoin was all about. And this was something that I had been interested in, just sort of helping people with, because I had such a hard time like getting all of the resources to learn and stuff like that when I was starting to program, that I had gotten frustrated and put together some material to help others. And that became sort of its own business. I decided to go off on my own and teach other programmers how to program in Bitcoin. And that was a business I started in 2017. It was called Programming Blockchain. And I did that all over the world. And, I think I told you before the show started that I visited like 5 continents in various capacities. Among others was teaching this course. And of course, like going to different conferences and speaking at those. But yeah, that's been a large part of my life, and that's where I ended up getting a contract to write a book with O'Reilly. O'Reilly is sort of like the premier technical book publisher in the country. and all over the world. And I wrote a book for them, Programming Bitcoin. It's available.
Yep.
And if you do program or know some programming, it takes you step by step from all of the math all the way down to, like the network protocol and things like that.
Okay, so for the programmers or technologists in our audience today, where can I get that book?
You could get it on Amazon. You could get it on at your bookstore possibly, but it is available. On Amazon. I think last I checked, it was like $43 or something like that.
Okay.
Yeah, these books, technical books, by the way, have gotten really expensive. They
Yeah.
wanted to price it at $90 when it first came out. I was like, what? $90?
Yeah, they're incredible. I worked for a firm that was at the time was the premier Oracle database consulting firm in the world. And these guys were best buddies with Larry Ellison, the founder of Oracle and all that stuff. And they left Oracle. And basically, whenever people got in trouble, they were the 911 Red Adair, go put out the fire guys. And when I was working there, it was kind of in the heyday. They had written 52 Oracle books. I mean,
Oh, wow.
for the average person, this stuff was like snoozeville, right? I mean,
why? But Oracle DBA was like a thing, right?
oh
Like
yeah,
that was a job description. So yeah,
yeah,
it makes sense.
absolutely. Completely. And they were books on programming and PSQL and all this kinds of stuff. And so
Yeah.
way back in the day. So I applaud you because writing technical books, that's not just something that flows like a story. I mean, that's pretty specific work.
Yeah, I mean, it felt a lot more like coding than writing a book. I've
Right.
subsequently written a couple of other books, but like that book in particular was just a lot. Like because I put so many exercises into it and like sort of hands-on stuff for people reading it and wanting to learn about Bitcoin. Like I had to just like debug a lot of stuff. So
Yeah.
there was a lot of like code inline and stuff like that, and had to make sure it was the same as in the GitHub repo that I set up for people reading the book so they can like download it and like work through the exercises and so on. So yeah, it felt a lot more like coding and
Yep.
and less like actual writing. Yeah.
So real quick, what are the names of the books that you have published so far?
So Programming Bitcoin, that was published with O'Reilly. The other two books have been they've been self-published on Amazon. So the first one is the Little Bitcoin book, and that's for lay people. You mentioned soccer moms before.
That's right.
That book is geared towards the layperson, right? And someone that doesn't know anything about Bitcoin. It introduces them to the problems with the current monetary system. Has a sort of a human rights angle, which I think is very interesting. So one of my co-authors is Alex Gladstein of the Human Rights Foundation, and believe it or not, Bitcoin is a huge thing in human rights right now because the first thing that a lot of governments do when they don't like a particular movement or something is cut off their financial access, and
right.
this is very common, and oftentimes like these human rights organizations have plenty of funding from external donors or whatever, but they have trouble getting money to the boots on the ground, the
Right.
people that are actually protesting or whatever. And Bitcoin is the one way in which they can sort of subvert all of that. Instead of all of the capital controls that come into the various things that various monetary systems that they happen to be in, they can now just use Bitcoin, and it's been sort of a game changer in that regard. And a lot of refugees coming out of Venezuela, for example, can now just sell all their stuff, put it into Bitcoin, and then cross the border into Colombia and sell their Bitcoin to start a new life, instead of what most refugees have had to do, like historically, which was try to move out of the country, get all their stuff stolen by border guards or government officials or whatever, and then like have to start completely over in another country, which is why a lot of however oppressive a government gets, usually they'll have a lot of people still staying, because even if they have very little, they at least have something, right? And it's very hard to move. So so that book goes into a lot of that. And then the third book is Thank God for Bitcoin, which is a moral argument for Bitcoin from a Christian perspective, and
Okay.
that this was also self-published with 7 other authors. And this, it's just a bunch of Christians that I met in my Bitcoin journey, and this gives more of a moral argument based on why our current system being so corrupt and being such a cesspool of theft and things like that. And I mean, I think everyone knows that something is wrong with the monetary system.
Absolutely.
This book sort of goes through, okay, here's what's wrong with it, and here's how Bitcoin like changes the game and fixes a lot of this.
My frustration with our monetary system in a global basis is, we've got 190 some different countries. The manipulation of the monetary system comes and goes based on the regimes that are, or administrations that are in power. And so it's really a scary thing, and it's never tilted in favor of the little guy. It never
definitely
is.
not. It's always been tilted in favor of the rich, and this has been the case since about 1913,
Sure.
when we more or less started the current system of fiat money.
Yeah.
And the thing is, like, when you have a central controller, we talked about centralized versus decentralized earlier. A centralized controller of money has what we call a moral hazard. They can benefit themselves or their cronies or their friends or whoever at the expense of everybody else. And this is what they can constantly do through money printing. And money is printed in the current sort of central bank-backed fiat monetary system through debt.
Yeah.
And debt is what everyone at every level has access to. And it's been absolutely horrible for our current system.
Oh, it's terrible. I mean, you look at the, it's easy to say governments are corrupt, but they all are, because those at the top are the ones who win. And I don't want to turn this into some big political thing.
Well, I don't either. But this is the thing that a lot of people don't understand about Bitcoin, is that they don't really understand what money is in the first place. And this is something that is purposefully sort of like not taught to us in schools, how money works or whatever. So just to give you a brief, very brief overview. The reason why fiat money came into existence in the first place is because governments wanted to spend more money than they had. So historically, this, when a government wanted to spend $1 trillion or something like that, they would have to raise $1 trillion in tax revenue. Now, that tends to be kind of hard because inevitably the government wants to spend 1.5 trillion and they only get 1 trillion in revenue. So, what do you do with that extra $500 billion? Like, where do you raise that? Traditionally, what they had to do was to go to the market and say, lend us $500 billion. And a lot of lenders would be like, no, we're not lending that to you. And like if you go back to like ancient England, for example, like King John, for example, he wanted to fund a war, right? Like wars are very expensive, and at one point he needed he didn't have any more money in the coffers, so he went out on the market to get loans, except nobody wanted to lend to him. Finally, he convinced some people to lend to him, and the interest rate was 216%.
Oh my goodness.
Crazy, right? Like because like all of those guys were like, well, there's no way we're getting paid back for this, but the interest payment, over like the first 6 months of it, he'll pay for 6 months and then he'll run out of money. At least we'll get our money back. So that was their thinking, and they charged him 216%, and predictably he couldn't pay it back. So basically he defaulted on the loan and so on. But that's what they had to do traditionally. Now, what central banking did, and the first central bank was also in England. It was the Bank of England in like 1690 something. Was make it so that they can expand the money supply and owe it to that bank. So that bank could do what's called fractional reserve lending, and that's based on the idea that what we think of as a bank should be like they get like $100 of deposit from me, and then they have $100 to lend.
Sure.
That should be the way.
But
the way it works is that the bank says, oh, you know what? I don't think Jimmy's going to withdraw this money for a while. So we'll say we lend out $200, right? Like, and each we have two counterparties, that two people that are borrowing $100. But they won't get the actual cash. We'll just credit it onto their account, right? And this is what's called fractional reserve lending, and it
Sure.
doesn't actually come due unless I ask for the $100. And this is what traditionally what's been called a bank run. If enough people try to go and grab the money, then the bank is bankrupt, or they're wrecked or whatever. So that system is like just fraud. I think anyone can kind of see that, but it became codified within the central bank. And this was what the government of England back in 1694 or whatever started doing, because they wanted to fund more wars or taxes or social services or whatever. They basically made it so that, okay, here's our budget. Let's say it's $1 trillion, and we're only getting 600 billion in tax revenue. Well, the bank is going to lend us $400 billion at a very low interest rate that they're going to determine. Now we can spend as much money as we want. And that's more or less how governments have been spending their way, like to whatever the heck they want for the last 100 years. And this is true everywhere in the world, is that they all deficit spend because they have the central bank that they call the lender of last resort. So nominally, when you have, like currently, I think the US budget is like 3 trillion. Or 4 trillion, and their tax revenue is like 3 trillion. So they have $1 trillion in deficit. Nominally, what the treasury does is they sell $1 trillion of bonds, and these are called treasuries, to the market. And there are some foreign countries that buy it for various reasons. There's some retail people, very few though, that actually buy these treasuries. But whatever is left, say they sell, $500 million worth, there's still $500 million left.
Right.
The lender of last resort is the central bank, and they go and buy it with money that they print, right? That they create everything there. This is how the monetary supply expands continuously, because in essence, they're taking from everybody else that's holding the dollar. They're expanding the supply of it. And this is why the fixed amount of Bitcoin is so important. It doesn't get expanded or diluted away, whereas the dollar does. And in particular with the US dollar, in the last year, because of all that's happened, the M2 money supply, which is a measure of all dollars that exist, has expanded from 15.5 trillion to 19.5 trillion. That's about a 34% increase.
Right.
So money is expanding at a tremendously fast rate, and it's all being stolen, not just from you and me, American citizens, but the biggest holders of dollars are actually, a lot of holders of dollars are actually people in third world countries. People in Nigeria, people in Indonesia or whatever. They love the US dollar because it's even better than their currency. So that means that this is what they save in, and as a result, that we're stealing from them every time we expand the money supply.
It's absolutely crazy, and it's mind-boggling because we don't ever stop and think about that. We're running our lives in this little bucket, and we don't ever really get our heads wrapped around that. And to me, as an old time, guy, I'm 55, and the national deficit, we're getting close to $30 trillion in debt. It's just, that's a number it just scares the pants off of me.
Well, think about that number. That's bigger than the M2 money supply.
Yeah.
All the money that exists, more
all
or
the
less
money
in
that
the world
exists,
is 19.5 trillion. They owe more.
Yeah. It's nearly double now. And so, you sit down and you think about, holy cow, all the aid and stuff, which I think is a lot of trivial that they talk about sending somebody 1,000 or 2,000 or whatever. That isn't going to make up for 10 months worth of, no income and stuff. I mean, it's a nice gesture, but we just keep taking trillions out of our pockets and piling it onto the debt. And it's going to be our grandkids.
We're stealing from all the savers.
Yeah.
We're stealing from everybody that has cash. And it's not just from the United States.
It's everywhere.
This is a tax on everybody around the world. And this has been the case since 1944, when the world basically went on the dollar standard. And I mean, every time the US expands its money supply, it's diluting some poor guy in Nigeria or something, and it's crazy to think about. But that's the case. And it's not just the federal government, right? It's state governments, they're issuing bonds. These are called municipal bonds. And those they usually get backstopped by commercial banks and so on. Commercial banks are also, of course, lending to large corporations. And that expands the money supply as well. So every time they get these giant loans, well, they're expanding the money supply as well. Even at the retail level, every time you take out a mortgage, right, it's not coming from somebody's savings, and this is something very important to understand. Okay, so say you have a $500,000 mortgage, that $500,000 is not from somebody that deposited $500,000 into the bank. And
Right.
if you think about it, it makes sense, right? Like if I were an investor, would I ever go for an investment that took 30 years to get back and is only like 3% a year with some credit risk, right? Because, who knows what might happen to them over a 30-year term.
Right.
I mean, like no one would ever do that. Like that's
No.
such a horrible investment. Yet that happens every single day with lots and lots of mortgages. So where's that money come from? Well, it's being created out of nothing. This is the ability that retail banks have because they have no reserve requirement. They have no opportunity costs. So they like if it were such the case that you had $500,000 and and that's all you had to lend, then you would be very careful about who you lend that to, and you would try to get the absolute best interest rate that you could out of those people with the proper credit risk. Instead, it's anyone who applies that meets a certain standard, you will get a loan. And it's guaranteed, in fact, and there's not even any risk to the bank because there's it's insured by Fannie and Freddie. So ultimately, it's money created out of nothing for your benefit, for the bank's benefit, since they're getting interest, for your benefit, since you get early access to the money. Well, who's it hurting? And this is the question that every economist asks is, what's the unseen effects of this? Well, the unseen effect is that everyone else's dollar just got diluted just a little bit. So ultimately, you're stealing from them too. And this is something that we point out in this latest book, is that morally speaking, the current system is all theft at every level, at every all debt that's incurred at pretty much every level is debt like this. It's expanding the money supply, and it's completely unfair. And of course, the people that get the lowest interest rates are the richest people, and they're the ones that are able to leverage the system to get even richer. And the poorest people have the highest interest rates. They can't expand the money supply very much, so they're the ones that get screwed the most.
It's crazy. Gosh, we could talk for hours on that because it's when you stop and try to wrap your head around that, it's an amazing situation. And most people don't even understand how it works. Okay, so let's dial back a little bit. With Bitcoin, current market rate for one Bitcoin is what, roughly 53,000 or more?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. How does the average little guy participate in Bitcoin? So let's say that, hey, I just got a bonus at work and I want to make an investment in Bitcoin. I want to be able to use this. Walk me through how that works.
Yeah, so Bitcoin is, again, divisible to 8 decimal places. So one Satoshi is worth like 0.05 pennies, so it's highly divisible. You could buy a penny's worth of Bitcoin if you really wanted to.
Okay.
So you can buy, 1/10 of a penny or even less. It's extremely divisible. So you don't have to buy a whole Bitcoin. You could buy a very small fraction of a Bitcoin and so on. So if you want to participate, there are multiple services that allow you to, buy Bitcoin for fiat money or, dollars or whatever. And it depends on the country that you're in. But here in the United States, you have Cash App, which is kind of like Venmo, but it's run by Square, which is, the CEO who is Jack Dorsey, who also does Twitter. But if you download Cash App and link your debit card to it, you can buy it in like 5 minutes. You can go and buy some, however much of Bitcoin you want. If you want $100 worth of Bitcoin, whatever, you can do that. Another service is Swan Bitcoin. Another one is River Financial, and those are more good for sort of like buying with dollar cost averaging
Okay.
mindset. So this is like, people try to time the market, and I always think that's a bad idea unless you happen to be really good at trading and like technical analysis and things like that. But if you're like sort of like a normal person that isn't an expert on technical analysis and things like that, then go and just dollar cost average, buy some set amount per week. Maybe it's like $20 a week or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
and you can do that for however, you just sort of set it and forget it, and it'll buy however much at a particular point in time, and so on. So that is how you do. Those are two other services. In there's another exchange, Kraken, that's pretty good, and that's
Okay.
more for slightly advanced traders, that want to time the market, or if you're not into dollar cost averaging and just want to buy in a lump sum. They have a lot of liquidity, so you can buy very large chunks. Kraken also operates in Europe, so if you're in Europe, that's a very good place to go. I have a friend from Australia that does Amber, and that's another Bitcoin exchange where you can buy with Australian dollars. But pretty much most countries around the world have some sort of Bitcoin gateway. I'm an investor in Rain, for example, and they operate in the Middle East, and people in Saudi Arabia buy Bitcoin through Rain and so on. So lots of different places to buy Bitcoin, but essentially, usually you're going to have to go through an exchange. There are people that don't like going through an exchange because they want it to be more private, or things like that. There's also peer-to-peer trading. There's a site, hodlhodl.com, and also Local Bitcoins, where you can sort of find a match. And this is good for people like in Venezuela who, they don't have an exchange because it's a highly regulated economy, but they can go find somebody that they can trade with and buy or sell Bitcoin to. And from what I've heard, this is a major way in which Bitcoin trading happens in Venezuela and many other countries.
Okay. So I'm the average American, or
Mm-hmm.
where, somebody, because we do have listeners all over the place, just about anywhere we speak English.
Mm-hmm.
How do I use Bitcoin? Okay, so let's talk about, dial it back. I
Mm-hmm.
buy some Bitcoin through Cash App here in the United States. Then what?
Well, so for most people these days, the main usage of Bitcoin is as a store of value, and what I mean by that is the ability to not have it be sort of like taken away from you through inflation. So
Okay.
in the economy today, there are three other assets that I would classify as store of value vehicles, and they are all going kind of crazy.
Yeah.
One is stocks, one is
Mm-hmm.
real estate, and one is gold. All of them have gone up tremendously during this monetary expansion, and for good reason. The extra money that gets printed, well, once somebody gets it, they're like, hey, I don't, I know that the money is expanding, so I need to put it into something that's not going to, devalue my money.
Right.
And this is why we have like unprecedented levels of the stock market, despite the rest of the economy like not doing that great. We have what we call asset inflation, and it's
Sure.
because people are trying to store value. Similar with real estate, similar with gold. There's a lot of demand for that stuff because people are realizing, okay, if I keep it in cash, well, it's devaluing, and you can almost see it in the grocery store too. Though that's almost the last thing that's going to grow in price. Like the first things are usually the stores of value, like stocks and real estate. So for now, stock, real estate, gold, they're good vehicles, but they all have sort of like drawbacks, right? Using stocks as a store of value can be problematic because,
Mm-hmm.
first of all, there's lots and lots of stocks. So you have to do a ton of research to figure out what to invest in and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Also, each of them has risk, right? The company can screw up. Maybe the drug that they were counting on doesn't come through. Maybe they get regulated in some way. Maybe they get a competitor. There's a significant amount of risk that happens if you're investing in a single company. Real estate, similar. It's got very high transaction costs, right? Like
Sure.
buying a home is like you have to pay like 6% to just the realtors and stuff like that. You also have a lot of different properties that you have to research. Again, it takes a lot of time, and there's sort of like a perception of luck, because if you buy in one area that happens to be in a hot real estate market versus somewhere that's not, it's going to go up more than the other. So it's based on a lot of like insider info and things like that. Similar with stocks, right?
Sure.
Gold is a lot better, but it's also heavily manipulated. The reason why we got into the fiat sort of standard in the first place is because they created, or they sold gold they didn't have, right?
Right.
That's always been the case. And you can't audit the amount of gold in the world and things like that. So there are problems with gold too. Bitcoin, and also it's physical, so you have to actually physically transport it, which kind of sucks. Bitcoin is used as a store of value because it solves all of those problems. So it's
safe.
You don't have to spend all of that time like researching or anything. The same Bitcoin that a Silicon Valley insider gets is the same Bitcoin that an Indonesian farmer would get. Mm-hmm. So they're like, it's a level playing field in that regard. It's also like it's perfectly scarce. So it's actually better than stocks, real estate, or gold, because it's hard to create real estate, but it can be done. All of those are expanding in supply in some way, shape, or form. Also, Bitcoin is digital, and it's completely unconfiscatable. So it's a bearer instrument. So I put it on like a hardware wallet or something like that. It is mine. No one can take it away from me. In fact, I could put it into 12 words and memorize them in my head and cut up everything else. And now, like, you really can't take it away from me. Like in 1933, FDR did Executive Order 6102, which seized all the gold from private citizens. This was something they could do because gold is physical and you can actually take it away. Mm-hmm. With something like Bitcoin, you could keep it in your mind. No one can take it away. They would literally have to torture you or something to get it out, which is usually not a step most governments are going to do.
Recently we saw a spotlight, if you would, on manipulation with the whole GameStop and Robinhood.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it exposed the system. There was a great book that came out at the end of the Clinton administration, and it was called The Democratization of Money. Now, it was a U.S.-based book, and basically there was 2 points. Number one was, wow, for the first time, Democrats had big bucks. So, the Tyson food family, and, all these people, it was cool and hip for Democrats to have money. But the second thing was in The Democratization of Money, great book, it's a great read, and it's still even applicable today, was because of the internet, for the first time, people had the ability to move their money on their own. Mm-hmm. Okay. They didn't have to go through a broker. So they literally could sit in their bathrobe watching CNN and taking the news in and then moving their money around because they didn't have to call their broker on Monday and those types of things. And so manipulation, not only we talked earlier about the government, but now that there's so much access to moving your own money, that we saw an amazing example of that with, and I'm not getting into the politics of Robinhood and stuff, but there are people who made a lot of money. And then when GameStop was limited and not been able to be sold, there are a lot of people who lost money in that situation. So market manipulation is really big. And I don't think people really understand how big of an issue that becomes, because now there's just a lot of, smart people that can make it, big moves in the market because they understand those things, and I think even COVID kind of contributed. There's a lot of people stuck at home, time on their hands in front of their computers, right? So,
well, GameStop in particular is a really good example of fractional reserve lending. Yeah, because what they did was the short interest was greater than 100% of all the stock in GameStop that existed. So lenders were rehypothecating the shares that existed and lending, even if they only possessed 100 shares, they were lending out like 400, right? And this is, I don't know if I really like the word market manipulation, but that right there is fraud, because you don't have 400 shares to lend and you're lending 400. That's fraud. And they did that because all of their friends, the hedge funds that were short GameStop, needed more shares to be able to short to bring down the market and so on. and that's fraudulent. Like
Yeah.
market, like to a degree that it screwed over everybody that had bought GameStop during the gamma squeeze or whatever. But that's the unfairness of the system, because there was more like they weren't playing by the rules of
No.
like logic or whatever. Instead, they were sort of gaming this crazy system where you have one party that controls all a bunch of shares, and they can do things that you shouldn't be allowed to do, which is lend out more than they have. And
Yeah.
that's ultimately what happened.
Well, and the scary part of that is, if you look from a morals perspective, this has been
Mhm.
going on a long time. I mean,
Yep.
this stuff is because the average person and the news didn't know anything about it. Those tactics have been going on forever. And then the other one that I struggle with is this is like a bunch of vultures waiting for a company to die, because
Mhm.
GameStop is, they were trying to make their money out of the misfortunes of GameStop.
Mhm.
I mean, they
Mhm.
closed 1,000 stores. They're trending down. They're having to go through a metamorphosis that most companies don't make it out. So these guys basically said, "Oh, this thing's going to die." So they're just vultures sitting around, betting on the last breath kind of thing.
Well, the betting itself and shorting the market is a normal part of the
Sure.
process.
Yeah,
What I
absolutely.
object to is them like sort of creating this all these extra shares of GameStop so they can crash it faster,
Yeah.
which to me is just so unethical. Like to the point, like you're like it's suspected that that's happening in the gold market as well, where
Yep.
gold vaults are selling gold they don't have because people will people want to borrow gold more than more than the amount that's in the vault, so they'll just like lend them gold that doesn't exist, just a certificate for it,
Yeah.
and they go sell it on the market. This is called naked short selling. It's so common,
Yeah.
and it's a big part of how the systems become so corrupt, because I mean the system is based on like helping the people that are cronies to the system, and not about fairness at all.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I got a lot of friends that make quite a bit of money, with
Mhm,
puts and calls and trading
mhm,
and stuff. And it's fair game. I get it. All right.
mhm,
I
mhm,
totally get that. Been around forever since the markets are there.
mhm.
But the average person doesn't understand that stuff.
Yeah.
Okay. So, all right. So it's a store value game. You're
Mhm,
protecting your assets. Okay. You're putting your
mhm,
money away and in something that is, I think the thing that I like about it the most is just because we have so much turnover on a constant basis with governments. I mean, it's just
mhm,
crazy. I mean,
mhm,
people making crazy decisions all around the world. I'm not even just talking about the
mhm,
US, just crazy decisions. So
mhm.
it really provides a safe haven for people and a safe harbor. And I don't think everybody understands that. So knowing what you know now, okay, I mean, you're as immersed in this business as anybody that I would ever bump into. Okay.
Mhm.
What do you think is the future of all this?
Yeah, so we're seeing some interesting things in the market. So the like 20 at least my conception of it 5 years ago was more like, okay, well, people are going to buy Bitcoin because it's the hardest money. It's the one that's going to store value the best. So it's in their own self-interest to go buy Bitcoin, and then enough people will do it, and then eventually like people will get out of the dollar, which is a corrupt system,
Yep.
and just go into Bitcoin, and then that'll be it. Like we'll be on a Bitcoin standard. A lot of institutions will crumble. There will be maybe some violent revolution here and there or whatever. I'm starting to rethink that, and I'll tell you why. 2020 was a really interesting year
Yeah.
because Michael Saylor started doing something that changed the game. So Michael Saylor is the CEO of MicroStrategies, and he announced sometime last year that he had put they're a company with a large cash balance sheet. I think he had like 450 million in dollars, and he was like, okay, well, I need to put. And he did some research, and he was just like, I need to put this money somewhere. What am I going to do with this? Um, Eventually, he came to the conclusion, okay, Bitcoin is the one safe place I can put it.
Right.
Otherwise, it's just going to get diluted away from me, and I want to protect shareholder value. That's my fiduciary duty as CEO. So he got permission from the board, and he started accumulating Bitcoin with that. And he put $450 million into Bitcoin and put it on as a treasury asset for MicroStrategy. Now, the interesting thing that happened was that MicroStrategy started trading as part MicroStrategy, but also part Bitcoin, because
Wow.
it's such a good asset. So soon after that, he started realizing, okay, there's something I could do with this. So he issued a convertible note, which is basically a bond that pays a certain percentage, but also can be converted into MicroStrategy stock should it hit a strike price. So he issued a convertible note for $450 million, which was the amount that he had in the treasury. But he wanted to double it. So he's like, okay, well, $450 million. And like he gave like almost no interest. So 75 basis points, 0.75%. And he said, and he set the strike price at like 40% above what the MicroStrategy stock price was. And he got oversubscribed by $150 million. So the bond was $600 million. He used all $600 million to buy Bitcoin. And he told everyone this was what he was going to do. And all of those bond investors were ecstatic because they could finally get some exposure to Bitcoin. And $600 million. So he has, his corporate treasury now has about $1 billion in Bitcoin, plus this convertible note, which, MicroStrategy stock now is like $960. So all of those guys are happy because now their notes convert. They made like 300% on their money. I think the strike price on the previous one was like 300 something. So like absolutely they're doing fantastic, right? They're all happy. Now, and then last week he announced another convertible note offering, this time 50% above the current price. And he did it for 600 million, which was what the previous note closed at.
Right.
And it was oversubscribed by $405 million.
Woo!
So it closed on Friday.
Then.
$1 billion, and he's going to start buying Bitcoin with that. So he'll double his corporate treasury again, so that it's going to be $2 billion worth. And here's the entire point. Like, a lot of assets are becoming Bitcoinized, right? So MicroStrategy is not trading necessarily on their business. I mean, that's a part of it. But large part of MicroStrategy is now Bitcoin. So it tracks with Bitcoin price at this point. And the thing about that stock was since 2017 to 2020, it stayed in a very small range, like 100 to like 150 or something like that the whole time. Now it's just going crazy because of Bitcoin. And he also had this seminar for a lot of other corporations. He called it Corporations and Bitcoin or something like that. Mm-hmm. And a lot of CFOs came in and they wanted to learn about how they can best use Bitcoin to their advantage. And these were all public companies. And you might have heard a few weeks ago, Tesla put $1.5 billion of their treasuries into Bitcoin. Into Bitcoin. And now Tesla is part Bitcoin, part electrical vehicle company.
Yep.
So what I think is going to happen is that a lot of the instead of like people going and buying Bitcoin, it's going to be these corporations and other assets that are very that a lot of people store value in, bonds and equities and things like that have a lot of store value in them. Well, they're going to start buying Bitcoin as a way to hedge against sort of like the big collapse that everyone is expecting, because everything is asset inflated.
Right.
So by doing that, now, Tesla is one, but I'm sure there, I talked to Preston Pish. He does the Investors podcast, which is one of the more popular podcasts on investors. And he thinks that there, like, a lot of companies probably already have Bitcoin on their balance sheets. They just haven't announced it. In which case, though, all those companies are more or less Bitcoinized, and the stock is a Bitcoinized asset. So in a sense, I think what's going to happen is that Bitcoin is sort of going to permeate through the economy and sort of stabilize a lot of it instead of having everything collapse, which is what I expected 5 years ago. So playing out long term, what I can see is that a lot of companies put Bitcoin on their balance sheet. There are insurance, like pension funds, insurance companies that are all putting, some allocation into Bitcoin. And like the market slowly becomes a little more rational with respect to Bitcoin. You're seeing PE ratios of like over 30 and stuff like that, which is really like a 2 or 3% return. Like there's no yield anywhere.
Right.
except Bitcoin. So it's going to get incorporated into all this other stuff. And as a result of that, the economy becomes a little more rational and stable. Although, Bitcoin is the big winner, and the government becomes, governments and other huge borrowers, get a little less of that power, because they can't just sort of print their way, or, borrow their way into prosperity, more or less.
Yeah, that's one of the things, you talked about this, is that the big time corporate investors in Bitcoin are going to have the same type of the same type of return that the rice farmer in India and in Indonesia has. It levels the playing field, and that is huge, because, gosh, if people knew, if they really just stopped and did some research and looked around, the amount of corruption worldwide is just, in the monetary systems, it's so broken. And so I've always been bullish on Bitcoin, but I didn't know the inner workings as much as we've talked today. So it's a fascinating topic. Now, you're working on a new book, or you just released one. What do you got cooking out there?
Well, so we released this book, Thank God for Bitcoin, in November, so it's fairly new, and
Okay.
it's got a lot of reviews on Amazon. You can go see it. Thank God for Bitcoin. Also, Russell Kung wrote the forward. He's the NFL player who is now getting paid in Bitcoin through Strike. So he's
Cool.
very much into Bitcoin. Also, one of the sharpest, smartest guys. He wrote the forward for the book. I wrote this book with 7 co-authors to make the moral case, because it really is a moral problem. And like you were saying, when a lot of governments have quote unquote independent central banks that really control everything, because they control who can print the money.
Right.
I mean, they can print the money and give it to whoever they want. And this is what we would call a giant moral hazard. And it's happened everywhere around the world, is that,
Right.
Whoever is closer to the money printer gets a lot of the benefits. So, for example, one of the questions that I like to lead with when I'm talking to someone about money is like, okay, last 50 years, where have the best and the brightest people been going, right? These are the graduates of Harvard or MIT or Stanford or something like that. Where do they go? What industry do they go in? And they think about it. I'm like, investment banking.
Yeah.
Think about that. They're all going into investment banking. Is it because they have a passion for investment banking?
No.
No, it's because that's where they can make the most money. And it's because investment bankers more or less have free access to the money printer, right?
Yeah.
Who was the biggest beneficiary of like all the PPP loans and stuff like that? It was BlackRock, right? Huge hedge fund. Like they got significant amounts of money from the government. And this is through all newly printed money. And this is the thing that we really need to recognize, is that the current monetary system is horribly unfair, not just to people in the United States, but all around the world. And it makes the rich people richer on a continuous basis. Like people will complain, like the people that got in Bitcoin early, they have an advantage. Well, you had that system already, except they can kind of double their advantage by borrowing a ton of money and then like investing in stocks or something, right? Like borrow at 0.5% and get like 7% on stocks. Like this is how rich people stay rich. Like one of the stats that I heard that was absolutely mind-boggling was Michael Bloomberg, 2008. He was worth something like $4 billion, and he's currently worth $20 billion. You think Bloomberg, the company, made $16 billion for him?
No.
Absolutely not. No, he was able to leverage the $4 billion he had,
Right,
so that he could borrow the hell out of anything, and just invest it into stock market or something like that. He gets tremendous leverage, and he's able to like basically quintuple his wealth in a relatively short amount of time, very, very quickly.
Wow. One of the things that bothers me is, here we are in 2021, February of 2021. The concept that we still have these basic dictatorships and monarchy type governments. When you look across China, North Korea, Venezuela, most of the Middle East, as far as they're not dictatorships, but darn near close. I mean, Saudi Arabia and those type of Jordan and those places. the manipulation that they can cause to their people is unbelievable. And the wealth that they create is unbelievable for themselves. This sort of disables or clips their wings a little bit because people aren't going to always be under that oppression from those systems. So, I mean, I have a hard time just on a regular basis thinking that in our world today we have dictatorships. I mean, that just is a crazy concept, right? It's a crazy concept. It goes against all logic, but we do. So anyway, now, is there a place, a couple things. Is there a place that people can come and follow you? Obviously, you're on social media, so Jimmy Song, right? SONG. Then how about your website?
It's programmingbitcoin.com. It has links to all of my books. And, you know, I used to teach people, but COVID sort of put a stop to that, but I may start that again. You know, in the technical specifics of Bitcoin, it's a 2-day course that I've done. It's like 8 hours a day and it's very intense, but by the end of it, you have a very good grasp of Bitcoin from a technical perspective. You know, I also have a YouTube channel, Off Chain with Jimmy Song. That's where I release my podcast. I also have a podcast, Bitcoin Fixes This, which is on many different platforms. I try to interview interesting people and, you know, sort of relate it back to Bitcoin. Gosh, I feel like I have other stuff. Oh, I have a newsletter, jimmysong.substack.com. It sort of gives you the Bitcoin news from a technical perspective every week. That I think that's about it. I'm also on Clubhouse. I don't know if you've been on that, but
I just got a Clubhouse account a couple days ago, and
I mean,
I'm on just about everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, for talkers like us, it's like a godsend because you get to constantly talk.
Constantly talk and that good stuff. Well, you've been a fascinating guest, and gosh, we could go for hours and hours. Now, okay, so we've given some out those online assets that people can follow you. Are there other, as a person who is immersed in this, because, just in my perspective here, Jimmy, you have transcended across the geek side of this, and you actually understand the personal side of this. So are there other resources that you could tell people to pay attention to as they start to educate? Because you know how the world is out there today. There's a lot of good resources. So are there some things that you could recommend to people in addition to your assets?
Yeah, there's a few books that I would really recommend if you happen to be a reader. There's from an economic perspective, The Bitcoin Standard by Safety Namus is absolutely fascinating. It's such a fun read too, because like the first half of the book is like the history of money, gets into like rhinestones and seashells and stuff like that, and it just like describes money from an economic perspective and argues for why certain metrics are more important than others and why traditional economics doesn't really work. And then the second half of the book is about Bitcoin. So really fascinating book. It's like the #1 book on Amazon for Bitcoin, and it is for a very good reason. It's an excellent book, and it describes things from an economic perspective that I don't think anyone comes close to doing. So that's a really good book. Another book, if you want to get into a slightly more technical one, like my book is like really technical, right? And the Little Bitcoin book is like for newbies. Something in between those two is Inventing Bitcoin by Jan Pritzer. So it'll give you a little more meat onto the bones of Bitcoin that I describe in the Little Bitcoin book. If you're a listener, if your sort of mode of learning is through podcasts and things like that, there's a couple of really good podcasts that I like. The Stefan Livera podcast is really good. He has a talent for sort of describing a lot of difficult concepts in very plain language. And if there's any particular thing on Bitcoin, he's probably done an episode on it. He's done like over 200 episodes or whatever.
Wow.
So he's really good. I've been on his podcast a few times. Another one that's slightly less technical is What Bitcoin Did with Peter McCormick. He's done a ton of podcasts as well. If you want to do something a little more economic, Safety Namus has a podcast as well. There's a bunch of YouTube content that's also really good. So my friend Tone Vase does more trading stuff. So if you're a trader, if you happen to be good at it or want to get into it or something,
Sure.
he's very good. And you know, he and I do the Bitcoin news quite a bit. Those of you that are fans might recognize this background or whatever. So he and I do a lot of news in that regard. Yeah, so he's pretty good for that. Yeah, and all of those guys that I mentioned before also like you know, restream on YouTube or whatever, and
Fantastic.
some of them have video. Yeah, there's a ton of other resources. And if you really want to know all of them, I think lopp.net, Jameson Lopp keeps a list of all different kinds of Bitcoin resources, lopp.net, and that's a good place to go just to, you know, look and see you know, what's out there. You know, they're like all these like intro videos on YouTube with like nice animations and things like that.
Yeah.
So those can all be good as well.
Well, you've been fantastic. Again, please, real slow so people can get it too, because you're an exciting, exuberant kind of guy. Share your YouTube channel one more time.
Off Chain with Jimmy Song.
Okay, and then your podcast.
Bitcoin Fixes This.
Bitcoin Fixes This. Great. Jimmy, you've been awesome. It's great to interview somebody who is so dynamic, so broad. Great to have a fellow family man on the show. Cowboy hat wearer, which I don't have mine on today, but you're the Austin Cowboy, Austin Bitcoin Cowboy. So it's been fantastic. I know this is going to be one of the highest listened to shows, and I will have you back. There's no question about that. There's so much more to deep dive on this, but thank you very much for coming on.
Well, thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Great. Okay, folks, we're going to call it a wrap for today. That is the episode from Jimmy Song. This is Rex with the Rex Andrews Show. So until next time, be safe, be bold, and make it a great day.